most people that play racquetball have no idea what went on, no idea the circumstances, and people that come from that era or have been playing for a long time come and ask me, as well as I'm sure many other racquetball players, what happened to racquetball? And you got to look at what made racquetball popular. And to say that, one direction is, well, you couldn't televise it, you couldn't grow it, um, didn't have big sponsors, didn't have, a lot of ideas. But the reality is racquetball didn't grow because of television. Racquetball grew because it's a great sport. Racquetball grew because everybody could play it. Racquetball grew because it's a great workout. That never changed. So what happened to racquetball, I think, was many things. And the Catalina Tour might be the first step to those many things. And you shared an article that Steve Keeley wrote about that era. And one thing stood out, and the problem with sports typically is power and money. And I would add, take away the money and just put greed, power and greed. And that, I think, was the start of the demise of racquetball. And at that point in 81, racquetball was huge. I mean, it was still one of the more popular, faster growing sports. People loved to play. Everywhere we played, crowds were immense, packed. Tournament draws were packed. And that went for years after 81. It didn't stop right there. I recall my last tournament win was 1985 in Baltimore, and that club was packed. You couldn't fit any more people in, and the enthusiasm, excitement, and that was 85. So certainly it didn't stop in 81, but I think the demise started. And looking back, when you talk about power and greed, it wasn't just one or two individuals. It was everyone trying to take as much as they can and not working together. And one of the problems that I saw back in that day, and Davey Bledsoe and a number of other players, is that the players didn't have a voice in racquetball. And Davey and I started the Pro Racquetball Player Association, and just to give the players a voice. And unfortunately, one individual in particular fought the Players Association to take away any power that they had. So that certainly caused a rift between the two organizations. Not to say we really had a great organization, it was just players that wanted to say, but we were top players. I mean, we had half of the top players on the tour. So when 1981, this Catalina Tour was announced, the first tournament was in Los Angeles or Orange County area at the King's Court. And it was September, first tournament of the year. And I was the defending champion of that tournament. I won it the previous year. And it was announced that I think it was 8 players would be regular players with 4 alternates, and the alternates would play into that tournament as an amateur the week before. And you could enter one tournament as an amateur in your region, and there were, I don't know, eight or 10 tournaments scheduled. And it just so happened that the West Coast, I lived in San Diego at the time, LA was my closest tournament, my region. So I literally went to that tournament the week before and had to qualify as an amateur qualifier, even though I was a defending champion of that event. And I believe I was ranked number 2 on the tour. So to me, that was a huge injustice, not only to me and what I've achieved, but to every other player that couldn't play in that event. And when that was announced, I took the tour to court to open up the tour. And because it was wrong, and my intent was to open it up. Well, I think right before the tournament, a week to 2 weeks before the qualifying, the judge made a decision that the harm, and I didn't understand the why it turned out that it had to just do with whose harm was greater, but the harm of canceling the tournament would be greater than the harm that I'm getting from not playing in that event, which was not the intent of the lawsuit. It was just to open it up, but it was what it was. So the tournament stayed closed. I went to qualify, and my draw was stacked. Every tough player in the qualifying I got to play, and I did qualify, and now I got to play the following week, the main draw. So while I'm playing, first round I think was Ed Andrews. I think I played Hogan and then Yellen in the finals. And honestly, the only thing I was thinking of every point, I had this vision of holding the microphone and telling the crowd my story, because they probably didn't really know what was going on and why players weren't there. So I had this vision of holding the mic and telling my story. And through the matches, beating Hogan, playing Yellen, beating Yellen was finally my chance to hold the mic. And Charlie Drake literally was handing me the winner's check, and he said something nice in front of people, and now's my chance to blast the tour, blast him, and blast everyone. And I just paused for a moment, took a breath, and all I said, I don't know word for word, but it was something to this effect of, I had a lot of things that I really wanted to say, but this is really not the time to say it. I just hope that my play was such that there's a lot of great players that weren't allowed to play in this event. I just hope I represented you well. And that was it. And the crowd went nuts. And really, that was far more powerful, I think, me saying that, because I was representing other players. It wasn't about me, it was about them. So that was it. I won that tournament. And up until that point, that would have been it. I wouldn't have been able to play in another invitational event because I wasn't one of the 8 and I wasn't invited. It just so happened that the CBC Classic was 3 days later. The tournament ended on Sunday. We flew to Edmonton for the CBC Classic. And that tournament was truly the biggest tournament of the year because it was televised, shown on ESPN, televised by a Canadian broadcasting company, and shown multiple times throughout the year. So that event was the most viewed event, and Hogan had to win that event. I mean, his stature, who he was to racquetball, the pressure on him was he had to win that event because that's what the racquetball public would see throughout the year. And it just so happened that in the finals of LA, Yellen kneed me in the thigh, and I had a really deep thigh bruise. And if anybody had that, they would know how painful it is. And it didn't bother me until I cooled down. And literally, I couldn't walk after the match. It was painful. The next day, I could barely walk, and I went to the tournament hobbling. And the Canadian National Medical Group that was there supporting the tournament, they would see me for at least an hour before every match and work on my leg. So by the time I was playing, I felt fine. And then after I cooled down, had the pain again, and they would do the same thing match after match. So thanks to them, I was at least 100% capable to play. And the CBC Classic was a very different type of tournament because since it was made for TV, literally when you called a timeout, the camera and announcer would come in and interview you. So that would throw, momentum off. It was a little bit different. You had to, certainly stay focused. And they changed the rule that you could not appeal a serve because they wanted to keep the game going. So for that tournament, that rule changed as well. So the tournament was amazing, and it was the colliding, I would say, of multiple factors. And not only was it the most viewed event, it could have been my last event of the year. Charlie Brumfield was the announcer, and we had all the top players there. The first round, we competed against the Canadian players. So the top 8 of the US played the top 8 of the Canadian, and then whoever was left played each other. And I think all the 8 Canadians lost, and then it was the top 8 US. Again, the only reason, if I didn't mention, the only reason I was there was they truly took the top 8 players based on the rankings of the year before. And as I said, I believe I was ranked number 2. So I was invited to that event based on my rankings, not based on any closed type tour. So now I'm playing Hogan. And when you talk about colliding of energy, him having to win the tournament, Dan Bertolucci refereeing the match, it was, and I'll say this, the greatest match of all time, not only because of what it meant, just had beaten Marty 4 days before, and the pressure that he had to win that to, sustain being number 1, and me beating him as probably, one of his bigger rivals, and who I was in the sport, where, I wasn't part of that Catalina Tour. So there was a lot going on that match. So the first game I lost, I believe it was 15-14. And he was up about 6-1 in the second game. And I remember calling a timeout and going out to get a drink of water. And the news crew rushed in and was interviewing him. And there was a monitor just to the right of the drinking fountain. And I don't know why I could remember that, but I see his face, I hear his interview, and he's talking about how he's in control of the match, how the first game shouldn't have been that close, how he's got this game well in hand, and the match is over. And it was like, really, I just beat him the week before, 15-14 in the first game, and the match shouldn't be that close. So um, I walked in the court, and from 6-1, I beat him 15-7. I just went right through him. He pissed me off so bad that, I mean, there was no way in hell I was going to lose that game. And so now we're playing the tiebreaker, which was an 11-point game. And he was up, I believe, about 10-8, came back to 10-10. And he gets this backhand setup, left side, deep, off the back wall. And he hits a backhand that left wall, obvious skip, front wall. I mean, obvious skip. And I've got my hands raised in victory. And he's yelling and screaming. I'm, just won the match. And there's a long pause, and Bertolucci calls Hogan's shot good, serve out. And I'm like besides myself. I appealed the call. One ref overturned the call. The other ref said he didn't see the shot, and we replayed the point. And literally the same shot comes up, back wall, backhand, left wall, skip, front wall. And again, raise my arms up, and Bertolucci, after a pause, side out, shot winner. And it's like, you got to be kidding me. And I hear Brumfield, who is probably the greatest announcer of all time. I mean, if anyone hopefully someone could find this match because it is a spectacle just listening to the commentating. He is the greatest, and yelling and screaming to the ref, take away his white cane, take away his white cane.
And here it is. Game and match point. Drive down the right, good drive. Wide angle pass by Hogan. The service trying to get it back. Hogan's got the backhand. Wide angle front court drive. You can get Marty goes back on his back. Oh, gets in! Gets in! That's the match. Slide out. Oh! Take away his white cane! Take away his white cane! Play Dylan. Let's watch the replay. Jerry snapping the ball back. Marty setting up off the back ball with his backhand. Driving it up. An obvious skip shot right up to the front court. But they both did the race to the wall. The lines were split on the call. We replay.
I mean, Brumfield couldn't believe these calls. And so Hogan comes in, and now he's serving again for match. I get him out again. And I serve this kind of a soft Z, and he hits this impossible shot, high backhand, that only he could hit in that day, and a splat. And it was a phenomenal shot. And he looks at me and said, when the pressure's on, I looked at him, and it's like, in his eyes, he knew, oh, he's got the match, right? That's all he needed. So he hits a similar serve, and I'm used to, as people would know my game, cutting off the ball and short hopping it. And I did that with my forehand, and I just ripped it in the left corner. Tough shot. Ball was probably at my waist, a little higher when I hit it. And, and I just said the same thing to him. That's when it's tough, just looked him right in his eyes. So I came in to serve, and I went for a crack ace serve to the right, and I hit it 6 inches past the line, cracked, stopped. Hogan dove for the ball. He got to the ball after the second bounce and just rolled to the front wall. And after all of that, with Hogan on the floor, Bertolucci called my serve short. So here I just won the match 3 times. And didn't get it, and easily could have broken me, but I was on a mission, and nothing was going to break me for that match. So served again, and we had a long rally. Hogan passed me to the left. I dove to the back wall on the left, barely got my racket on it, flipped it to the front wall. I was stuck on the left side, and the ball was about 5 feet from the left wall, 3/4 deep, and Hogan hit a forehand pass to the right, and I was stuck on the left. So all I could do was I ran back. I barely got my racket on it, running back to the back wall, just flipped it to the front wall. And the ball was going about 2 miles an hour, just floating to the middle of the court, and literally about 1 inch, 2 inches above the floor, just hit the front wall and just stopped. I mean, it just barely made it. And that's how I won the match.
Very, very tough to serve in that basket. That ball was very close to being over. Beautiful drive, great diving get by Hilecher. Hogan sets up for the big forehand, goes down the right wall. Hilecher cuts it off.
Come on!
Jerry Hilecher with the upset, knocking off defending champion Marty Hogan in a tiebreaker. And what a tiebreaker it was. Hilecher the winner, 11-10 in this tiebreaker.
There's the power drive down the left side. Jerry leaving his feet, lifting it up, making the roll. Marty backing up to crank up in that big forehand shot. Steps into the ball, rips it down the line. Jerry off balance, tweak, it goes in for a winner.
And it was probably fitting because it was so slow, Bertolucci couldn't have missed that call. And here it was right in the middle of the court, and the match is over. And I won, and I had to play Yellen in the finals. And I had about an hour's rest. That match took 2.5, 3 hours. And I literally had to play another match after an hour. And Yellen's game also went the tiebreaker. And I was up 10-1 in the tiebreaker, and Yellen came back to tie it at 10-10. And I remember him hitting this deep shot to my backhand, and I hit it cross court as hard as I could, and probably went 50 miles an hour because I was so tired. And Yellen never dove. I never saw him dive. He didn't dive then, but he outstretched arm, and my 50-mile-an-hour backhand pass just barely got past his racket, and I won the match. So here I was, winning the first two tournaments of the year, and my season would have been over. I mean, literally, that was it for the last tournament of the year for me, not being part of the tour. And Drake's assistant, John something, can't think of his full name, comes up to me and he says, Jerry, I think we're going to put you on the tour. And I literally here I'm ranked #1. I mean, how couldn't they have me on this tour? So my response was, that's probably a good idea. And I got to play. But the damage was done because the damage was the tour was closed. And it didn't have to be. The tour did not have to be closed. And what that meant was the most visible vehicle of racquetball was a closed tour to, a few players. And that took away the ability for young players to have a future. Young players to say, I want to be a professional racquetball player, and to think that, well, they could play in one event in the year and qualify. Who's going to make that a career when they have the one event? So when I say that was the demise of racquetball, it took away the desire of young players to see potential for themselves to make a career in racquetball. And I saw something in that Keeley article that made absolutely no sense. I mean, it was bizarre. And, Steve, I know, is an incredibly smart guy, and I have a ton of respect for him and his writing. One of the smartest players that I've ever met on the tour came out and said something to the effect of, well, Catalina was worried about the money it costs to clothe players, and that's why they wanted to restrict it to fewer players because of cost of clothing. I mean, are you kidding me? Does Nike restrict their sponsor players from the shoes? I mean, it costs pennies on the dollar. I mean, they're the manufacturer. So that's bizarre. That's absolutely not the reason. And it was because of greed and money, wanting to control the sport. And again, that was the start of the demise of racquetball. Soon after that, myself and Davey Bledsoe was talking to Playboy, who wanted to sponsor the Pro Tour, and they were coming in with 10 events for $100,000 per event. And we literally had a handshake agreement. I mean, back then Playboy was huge, and that would have just been, a shot in the arm of racquetball. And Playboy pulled out, and they pulled out because they didn't have all the players committed. I could only think of why that was the case. So again, power and greed. And here we are looking back at what might have been, what could have been. Thankfully, I was part of an amazing era, amazing time for racquetball, and yet I was also able to see that change, which is truly unfortunate. Wonderful event for them to put on. I think the government had something to do with racquetball and supporting racquetball.
Who can you name, Jerry?
Well, the U.S. certainly. Davey Bledsoe. I'll pass on the next three because those are Canadians, and not any of the top players, I don't believe. There's a young Dave Peck. I think that's Kruger next to Peck.
Yeah.
Hogan, there's Wayne Bowes, Ben Colton, Don Thomas, a mustache Jerry Hilecher, which I cannot believe. Canadian, Lindsey Myers, Craig McCoy, And then they are the women up front. So yeah, 2, 4, 6. And the only US women is Shannon Wright, Heather Mackay. So
But she was Canadian also.
she was. So that must have been an exhibition. And there's Dan Bertolucci. So as you can see, it says Catalina CBC International Racquetball Classic. So that was the Canadian event.
Hogan's still smiling. Was this before or after you beat him?
It was way before, because people, after they lose, they leave usually. And some of those players had lost Wednesday or Thursday. Great picture. Love that. Thank you for sharing.